Grades do not define you. In fact, they are a very inefficient way of measuring attainment. And today I want to talk to you about how they can damage students and their relationship with education, and ultimately why the school system requires a new model. But first, I'm going to go and get some tea. Essentially, I believe that the education system is stifling creativity. It ultimately, I think, prevents people from properly enjoying the process of learning and seeing learning and education as something interesting and exciting. Alexander the Great said that education is not the filling of a bucket, but in the current climate, that's exactly what it is. GCSEs and A-levels are the filling of a bucket. You're just required to learn a certain amount of stuff and then recall it. You fill up your bucket, then you empty your bucket. You fill up that bucket, you empty it. It's all very methodical. But he says instead it should be the lighting of a fire. We should be curious, we should be excited, we should want to learn more, and we should do a lot of that for ourselves. But the education system does not encourage that. The grading system prevents us from being curious. So to preface this, what are the benefits of curiosity? Why is curiosity important? Studies show that curiosity makes us happier. It makes life less boring, and people that are more curious apparently find more meaning in life, which is quite a huge thing to say. Actually, Peter Godfrey Smith, in his book Other Minds, it looks at cephalopods and the brains of cephalopods and how these are some of the most intelligent creatures. And Godfrey Smith argues that the intelligence of the cephalopods, of octopuses and cuttlefish, come from their curiosity. Instead of doing something because they have to do it because of survival, so, hunting, finding food, cephalopods play with things. Like, they will pick things up and they'll throw them about, and they're interested in things, that they'll try and understand how it works. And Peter Godfrey Smith argues that this curiosity, this innate wish to learn more about the world and understand why things work, just for the sheer sake of it, is what defines their intelligence, and offers a definition of intelligence which is based in curiosity. And yet it doesn't feel like the education system is encouraging us to do this, encouraging us to kind of like play with information, develop interests around information. Just for some context, my name's Ruby. I recently graduated with a first from Exeter University, and I got straight A's and high grades the whole way through my time in school. And I do not believe for a second that grades show intelligence. The whole way through school, I wanted high grades. I wanted to score the highest. If I got 90%, I'd think, no, I should get 100%. In some of my GCSEs, I got 100 UMS, and I beat myself up because I should have got 100%. It was an endless cycle of perfectionism where I based my intelligence and my self-worth on the grades that I received, and I know that so many other students have the exact same thing. I based my intelligence on the marks I was getting. On marks, on numbers. I mean, at what point did we decide that education and intelligence was a quantitative thing, like something which could have a number, that you could put a number on the way that you think? That just, I mean, it's such an alien and absurd concept, I think, when you actually think about it. Alfie Kohn calls exams relics from an Enlightenment age, an age which was obsessed with quantitative data, methodical rote answers and memorization, very like Mr. Gradgrind from Charles Dickens' Hard Times. As I've grown older, I have realised that this is not the case at all, and that intelligence and grades do not go hand in hand. For one, just anecdotally, I know so many people who are incredibly intelligent and yet did not get really high grades. And of course it goes the other way as well. There are chemistry tests that I've taken, got 100% on, and not fully understood the concept. Tests that I've got 100% on because I memorized the material and I knew the best way to answer it. These are tests where I wasn't even really thinking about my answers. I just knew it. It was rote memorization. How is that intelligence? I could explain these things in the words that the examiners wanted to hear. And at the time, honestly, I'd look at these marks and I'd think, oh wow, look, I'm doing really well. I'm very good at chemistry, but how is that building intelligence? But let's backtrack. What actually is the grading system and why is it ineffective? And to think about that, the first thing I feel we need to consider is what actually is the purpose of education. Please excuse the fact that I'm going to be jumping between yesterday and today's clips. In 2012, Deborah A. Widowson conducted a study where she interviewed students, parents and teachers and asked them to say what they thought the purpose of schooling was. So she gave 4 options: to learn and gain self-knowledge, to develop life and social skills, to optimise life chances and quality of life, and to enable future employment and economic well-being. So the first two are focused more on intrinsic learning, and the last two are more based on prospects for the future. For the most part, teachers, parents and students prioritised education as being for the sake of learning. So those first two things, to learn and gain self-knowledge, and to develop life and social skills. There are many different schools of thought when it comes to education. There's perennialism, essentialism, progressivism, reconstructionism, existentialism, so many different ways of approaching education and the best way to educate young people. The essentialist model of education says there are key things that all young people should know about, and these are things which basically help us to navigate modern society. Perennialist education theory says that these are fixed truths, but essentialism accepts that these can change depending on the culture. The focus here is on preparing students for wider society and to communicate logically because they know basic truths about the world. This is especially important with something like religious education, where it is important for students to know that there are 5 major world religions. And Neil McCain, in his In Defense of Essentialism, writes, "To essentialize is to simplify so as to enable understanding." But the implication here is that once we know these essential truths, we are then going to do something with them. We are then the focus there in that sentence is on understanding. We essentialize so that we can then later aid understanding. And yet, as I'll talk about in just a second, memorization does not necessitate understanding. And essentialism is also valuable for teaching key skills. Children need to be able to read and write and communicate logically and speak persuasively. But we also learn something. We learn a key skill at school which is damaging in adult life, and that is this hyperfixation on grades and external validation. Instead of focusing on the material as the end point, we are encouraged to think about the grade as the end point, which is a huge difference. The government needs to make sure that these things are being taught, and so exams are a way of doing that, grades are a way of doing that. But ironically, this seems to be to the detriment of the material, because as we will see, by moving into this grading system, we are inhibiting understanding. And it's ironic because this is not, well, hopefully not, the intention of education. I mean, the curriculum is very well thought out. It's built for understanding. It's built in that kind of essentialist way of like, we want students to learn about these key things which will help them in adult life. Like when developing the new curriculum or reforming the curriculum, there's so much back and forth from professionals and teachers, and like it's a big thing. It's a peer-reviewed thing. Grading came about because we need to standardize this. The 1870 Education Act was the first official piece of legislation which made schooling mandatory, and in this the government was committing to providing national education so everyone would have access to it. And of course, if you're going to have national education, you need to be able to keep that in check. You need to be able to make sure that people are actually educating. If you've got a national curriculum, you want to make sure that that material is actually being taught. And so exams, grading, I mean, it seems like making sure that education is occurring basically. So in 1918, the school certificate was introduced. You do your junior certificate when you were 16, and this would be a qualification that you'd walk away from school with. This was then replaced by O-levels in the 1950s. This was replaced by GCSEs. It's a way of standardizing education and making sure that everyone is covering the same material. You know, that very carefully formulated curriculum which has been proposed. Funnily enough though, until 1975, O-levels were only a pass or fail, and marks have just got more and more specific as the years have gone on, especially with the introduction of the new GCSEs which grade from 1 to 9. Grades today are less about checking whether the material has been taught and are instead claiming to assess intelligence. In 2010, White and Fantone did a study where they abolished grades in medical school and instead just gave a pass or fail for the assessments done, and there were no disadvantages to this. And a pass and fail just basically makes sure that the material has been taught and that you understand it to, you know, a good enough standard, which should be enough for the essentialist mode of teaching. For the last 8 decades, there has been criticism of grades from academics. It's shown just how long we have realised that there is an issue with it, and yet they are still here, and they are more important, I think, to students than ever. We know anecdotally that the focus of school, and many of us, is grades. There is a hyperfixation on learning something, doing something well, so that you can get a good grade on it. And we saw this during lockdown, when the GCSE curricula were minimised to compensate for the time that students have had at school. We saw teachers cutting stuff entirely from the syllabus. The things which were not examined on were not taught. And I think this just encapsulates how focused on grades we are. I remember at school, our lessons were largely just targeted towards like, how would an examiner want you to answer this on a paper? What answer will give you the best mark? And I remember this time when I was in GCSE physics, and there was this answer about like defining a black hole. The mark scheme said a black hole absorbs everything and doesn't let anything escape, not even light. You know, wrote this, but then on top of that said, oh, apart from Hawking radiation, because Stephen Hawking says that there's this thing, Hawking radiation, which can be expelled from a black hole. It's a theory, but I wrote it down on my paper. And my teacher was like, you can't write that. You're like, the examiner will think you don't understand the material and they wouldn't give you the mark. I mean, how silly is that? What? Like, doesn't make sense. Also, it's getting kind of dark, so I think I'm going to come back to this in the morning. Sorry for the change of outfit. So what actually are the problems with grades, and why is this detrimental when it comes to the way that students learn today and the way that we approach our studies and education and learning about the world? And to understand this, we need to think about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is where we focus on an endpoint, some kind of reward. That might be a chocolate bar, a break, or a grade. Intrinsic motivation is where we are motivated to do something simply for the pleasure of doing the act in itself. This is something I have spoken about quite extensively before, especially in the videos that I've done about breaks and the psychology of breaks. When we focus on extrinsic rewards, so something like grades, we do not end up enjoying the work as much. One of my favourite studies took 2 focus groups and gave them both a puzzle to complete. The first was paid per puzzle completed and the second was not paid. 2 groups were then told that they could have a break, and the group who was being paid was much more likely to take the break than the ones who were not being paid, many of whom used this time instead to keep on working on the puzzle. This is just one study which shows how a hyper-focus on rewards can take away from the enjoyment of the task itself. Number 2, grades encourage students to take an easier route. When the focus is on the grade and not the material, it makes sense that students will find smart ways to get the grade that they want to get. Mayer and Midgley said, an overemphasis on assessment can actually undermine the pursuit of excellence. Because here, the grade and not the learning is the important thing. So Kohn talks about how students might choose material that they're more familiar with or shorter books to write about so that they can maximise their chances of doing well, which of course seems rational if this is the way that we're being encouraged to think about the material. The focus is on success more than learning. Actually, in the United States especially, it is reported that there's been an increase in cheating among high-achieving students who want to do well and get good grades. 2 really good books which look at this actually are Alexandra Robbins' The Overachievers and the fictional book Enter Title Here, which honestly, the protagonist in this is awful. She is an overachiever and will do anything to get high grades and will cut corners wherever. Her main focus is on grades, but I think this is a really interesting book for what we're talking about. And then number 3, Kohn argues that it reduces the quality of students' thinking, because leading on from number 2, we're only being encouraged to learn what we need to know. So we're more likely to skim books. As I said before about GCSE exams, learn the things that we have to learn and not anymore. And of course, again, this makes sense. It's rational because there is so much material which needs to be learnt. And if you don't memorise it, you won't do well. Then that might be harmful for future prospects. It's a really hard one because even if we want to learn more about it, it's difficult to do that and still do well. In 1987, Grolnick and Ryan did a study where they taught 2 groups of students the same material. One group was graded and the other group was not graded. Then a week later, they tested the students on this material, and the ones who had been tested after learning the material, memorised it in a rote memorisation fashion, could recall much less than the ones who hadn't been tested, which I found really surprising. This is because the second group could focus more on understanding the material as opposed to just memorising it, which meant that they had better levels of understanding and they could remember it longer term. It just angers me so much that this is the way that the education system works. Then there's a 4th thing I just want to mention, which is about competition and how grading encourages competition between students. I think so much of education and learning is about collaboration and dialogue. In academic scholarship, for example, so much of academia is just kind of conversing with each other through papers. So somebody publishes something and then that's criticised and it's built on, and so you have this amalgamation of information and understanding. But there was a Butler study in 1992 where again we have 2 focus groups and both were asked to do some art. One group was graded on this and they were given an imagination and creativity score, and the other one was not graded. And when they put all of the artwork on show for each of the group who hadn't been graded were much more interested in looking at their peers' work and like examining them as creative pieces of work, whereas the graded group were not so interested, and they were more interested in the grades their peers had got, like thinking about their own work in relation to everyone else's. And it just seems like quite a sad thing to see. It feels like we should be more collaborative, and like knowledge and education should be something where we're working together as opposed to everyone being pitted against each other, which we see even in the distribution curve. Like we have a bell curve for judging how well people do at GCSE and A-level. So literally you can only do well because you're like doing better than other people. That does not make sense. So yes, in summary, basically, grading is not good for students. It prevents us from fully engaging with material, it discourages us from engaging with material, and it stifles creativity. The ancient Greek philosophers said that education was a way of drawing out evil. And Barker says that education is medicinal. Education is a way of guiding us towards truth. If we want to be curious and interested about the world, if we want to light fires, then we need to minimise the impact that grades have and minimise the importance of grades. Alfie Kohn notes that it's unrealistic to get rid of grades entirely, but he does come up with some really good suggestions, which I'm just going to run through briefly with you now. Number one, he suggests getting rid of letter and number grades and simply giving pass and fail marks, which, as we've seen, are just as effective.
Sorry, editing Ruby jumping in, but when I say that, I mean much more effective.
Number two, why don't we stop grading younger students? Grades might be useful for university applications, like kind of leaving exams, but maybe we don't have to grade kids when they're in year 7, year 8, year 9.
This might just mean that we don't grow up with that hyperfixation on grades, which means that it's easier to separate our self-identity from them when we get older.
Number three, teachers can focus on offering feedback instead of grades to, again, just minimise the hyperfixation on grades which students are currently encouraged to have. Number four, and I really like this, students being encouraged to negotiate with their teachers about their grades and have it as a dialectic thing as opposed to just be given a number. That kind of feeds into that feedback element.
And also takes away some of the power of grades because they're not certain and absolute in the way that I think a lot of students think they are. As a result, hopefully this minimises their power.
The education system needs to improve. We all have teachers who looked beyond grades and made the material more important than the grades. My English teacher for GCSE and A-level was like this, and one of my professors at university who taught me early modern studies was like this too. And my early modern professor especially saw it as more of a tick box thing. It was something that she had to do. She had to assess us. But she didn't want to. But she didn't want us to interfere with the material. So she put all of the assessments in the first 6 weeks, and then the final 6 weeks we were just able to learn the material for the fun of learning it. And even then, the first 6 weeks was portfolio tasks, which were much lower intensity. And I think that as a model is much better. It just feels wrong that everything in your education should lead up to exams at the end, because that sets exams as like the only purpose of doing school at all. Yeah, basically, I don't really know what the point of this video is apart from to get you to maybe think more about the education system and the problems which exist here, the problems with grades, and to maybe try and reassess your own relationship with grades. How much do you focus on grades? How important are they to you? Can you minimise the impact and importance that they have for you? Because ultimately, the research suggests that if you can minimise this impact, if you can stop focusing on grades as much, then you will be able to understand the material better, you'll find the material more exciting, and ultimately, hopefully enjoy your studies more, enjoy school more. When I made this my focus, I enjoyed school and studying so much more. I always noticed a difference between the beginning of the school year and the end. At the beginning of the school year, I loved what I was learning. I loved studying, and I could spend hours and hours and hours studying and learning this material and not get stressed at all. It would literally be my favourite way to spend an afternoon. And then it would get to exam season and it would be a completely different situation, because then my goal, the only reason I was doing any of this work, was to get a certain grade, and that sucks the fun out of it. I mean, it's quite a basic thing to have realised, and I don't know how I didn't realise it before, but I didn't realise why I grew to dislike my work the closer to exams that I got. But reading this research and doing research into grading and the psychology of grading, I think it makes a lot more sense. So I just tried to have a think about a few things that you can do as a student. I think the system ideally needs to change. Like in the UK, the education system needs to change, the way that we grade students needs to change, but that's a governmental thing, that's much larger scale. And so I've tried to think of a few things that you can actively do to try and minimise the impact of grades and get yourself to focus more on the material. Number one, ask for feedback on things as opposed to grades. I had teachers who would do this. I had university professors who would do this. Instead of giving us a grade or a mark, they would just give us feedback. And this always really annoyed me. I was like, I just want to have a mark. I just want to know what I get. But I think this is so important. And so if your teacher gives you just feedback, try and resist the urge to ask for a mark, which I honestly never resisted. So I'm giving you that advice, but I think it's quite hard. Number two, I mean, we do have to look at grades. Like, grades, like it or not, are important, just in a societal sense. But as we saw, pass or fail is a more effective model than A to U. The A to U is more effective than like looking at your actual percentage points. So try not to focus too much on percentage points. Try not to like focus too much on that individual number. Number three, try and find time to learn things outside of the curriculum. Even if this is only for 10 minutes a night or 15 minutes a week, encourage yourself to take one thing that you learnt that week at school or university and look into something there that interests you personally. Just get yourself to do something where it's not going to be graded and it's not going to help you at all with your final exams and final marks, but it's just kind of recentering the purpose of education, I guess, for us. Number four, think about why the material is actually important. Maybe mind map this, look into how something you're learning is relevant to the world today, or how it can like help with social reform. Yeah, hopefully some of those things will help to get us more interested about the world. I'm not really sure though. If you've got any other piece of advice, anything that works for you, then please leave it down below. I'd be very interested to hear. And if you have any thoughts about this, what are your thoughts on the grading system? Do you think it makes sense? Is there something really big that I've missed? I'm just really interested to hear other students' perspective on it, because mine has definitely changed the more I've thought about it. I used to accept grades just as like something important, and I've put so much of myself into grades, I've invested so much of my self-worth into grades. Just more and more I'm realising how banal they are and how problematic the whole system is. So yeah, what are your experiences? Let me know, and I just want to say thank you for watching, and I hope that you have a productive week.